My name is Mark Aylward, and I'm here with my good friend and colleague, Jeff Otis. And Jeff and I have been collaborating for a few years now in the leadership space, among other things. And we have a lot in common personally as well, families and athletes and things of that nature, and entrepreneurship. But leadership's kind of been something Jeff's lived in, and I've lived in for, gosh, maybe 30 years. And this particular series is all about leadership, and we're trying to keep him to about 10 or 15 minutes, make them simple. But we're going to talk about one of the components of leadership that I think is extremely important today, and that's communication. And because communication is such a broad topic, we're going to try and carve out maybe a couple of subtopics of communication. So, Jeff, let me toss it over to you. You had a kind of a framework that I really liked. Maybe you can open up with that.
Yeah, I mean, communication is one of those rabbit holes, right? Because you're communicating verbally, communicating by text, communicating in emails, and there's obviously nonverbal communications. There's lots of ways that communication's constantly taking place. But, one of the things I learned early in my career is there's typically four attitudes that you're going to face whenever you're communicating or working to lead anybody anywhere. And those attitudes are acceptance. They accept what you're saying or they accept you as a leader and they're willing to follow. There's either skepticism, they don't believe it, or there's some doubt that what you're communicating is viable or worth following. There's going to be indifference where they just don't care. They just, they see no perceived value in taking action on what you're communicating.
Mhm.
And then the fourth attitude you face typically is objection. And there's generally either objection due to a mis and I think what you and I were talking about earlier is all of these attitudes that you face in the world of communicating with people require you to lead with questions and really flesh out, um, maybe some of those core motivations that so you can better understand who it is and what they're thinking in terms of what you're trying to communicate.
Yeah, that's a great framework. I think if you kind of prepare for all those four prongs, you're not going to get ambushed most of the time. One of the things that makes me think about is I used to hold these sales meetings years ago, and I would say on average I'd have maybe 10 people in a room, and every so often I would tell everyone, I want you all to take your own minutes, right? And
Yeah.
jot down, and then you can pass them in to me. And I got to tell you, Jeff, 100% of the time, I would get 10 different versions of what I said in the
Yeah.
same room, the same words, same tone, same body language. And I'll always remember that because I think it speaks to this issue of clarity. And I think that I do. I mean, I fancy myself as a very good communicator, and I'm sure you do too. But that doesn't mean we're always clear.
Yeah.
We intend to be clear,
Yeah.
but I think one of the takeaways and is don't assume that everyone understood what you said. And some of the mechanisms that we talked about earlier, one in particular that I've used with my daughters in their own businesses, is when you have a conversation with someone every time, but particularly when it's about something relatively important. Let's use the example of money and payment terms, margins, prices, length of term of the contract, whatever it is. And I've had more often than not people come back and say, that's not what I took away from the conversation. So I adopted a long time ago this habit of following up on those conversations with emails, giving the person the opportunity to say, hey, this is what I took away. Is this what you took away? And more often than not, somebody would say, 90% of that is what I took away, but this is how, when you said this is what I thought you meant. And that's the
Right.
opportunity right there to clarify. And it sounds simple, but it can cost you a lot of money if you don't do it. Certainly a lot of frustration.
Well, 100%. Like I mean, what do they say? Everybody's perception is their reality, right? Like, so we often think we're communicating with clarity, but we've often given, hours of thought to whatever it is we're going to communicate. And so in our mind, it's crystal clear. And when we go to communicate it, there's going to be different interpretations based on individuals, their unique experiences and moments and influences. And I remember very distinctively, I was running a company and one of the things we did is we always flew our top performers away every 6 months for a little retreat, and we worked on the business. And these were people coming from all sorts of different offices. And one of the things we did was we never flew anybody together on the same plane. Just in
Hmm.
the event the plane went down, we didn't want the company to go down, right? And
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'll never forget communicating to one of our assistants when she was booking the travel is like, yeah, we need to get all these people over to Maui, but we can't have them sitting together on the same planes. Well, in my mind, that meant different planes. In her mind, it meant we're going to have 5 different people in 5 different spots on the airplane, right? So we all got on the airplane, looked at each other, crossed our fingers, and fortunately we made it. But it was such a small, little, simple example of how communication can be sort of misinterpreted.
Yeah, no, that's funny. Yeah, it happens all the time. When we both have been in the recruiting space, staffing space for a long time, and you know, so you're communicating with the candidate, right? Then you're
Yeah,
communicating with the client. Sometimes someone else in the organization is communicating with the client. Well, you got potentially four people in that conversation. You tell me something, I tell her something, she tells them something. And I can't tell you how many times, Jeff, I'm sure you feel the same way. That's not what I said. That's not what I said. People have a tendency, I think, to say what they think the other person wants to hear.
yeah,
And I think this goes back to something that we discussed a while back. Our friend Jim likes is, would you rather have somebody that was being nice to you, or would you rather have someone who was being kind to you? And kind people tell you what the truth is, and nice people tell you what you want to hear. And I
yeah.
think you really have to take the responsibility of if someone's trying to be nice to you, you have to try and do what you can to move them into that kind position. And I think what I mean by that is people will be candid with you if you encourage them to be candid with you. But if you don't, I think it's a 50-50 proposition.
Well, it's a really good point. I mean, you and I both grew up playing a lot of athletics and surrounded by great coaches and stuff. And part of what I'm hearing you say is, that kindness also can come in the form of directness, right?
Mm-hmm.
And directness can be misinterpreted. Well, they don't like me. No, they're just trying to get very direct in terms of either sharing expectations or communicating whatever it is they're trying to communicate. And I think sometimes that can get misinterpreted,
Mm-hmm.
or we can bring too much emotion into that when reality is all we're trying to do is create clarity and crystallize whatever's being communicated.
Yeah, I think it's a real skill, and I think all of this stuff requires practice. Nobody's really good at this out of the gate. It's a
Yeah,
real skill to be candid without being condescending. It's a real
yeah,
skill to be candid without being confrontational. And candid without being confrontational is, I think I see an opportunity here for us to really help you improve on what you're doing. You know, phrases like that, and I also find myself following up a lot. And this one's tough. This one's tough to not sound condescending, but I seem to be able to do it. Was that clear? Did I make that clear? I want to make sure that you and I walk away from this conversation with the same understanding. So there's all kinds of different like mini techniques that you can use, but I think that if you're the two most important things that I would want people to take away from this little conversation is that clarity is of paramount importance, and you can't presume that the other person is taking away what you wanted them to take away unless you kind of follow that up, whether it's an email or a question or a series of questions. And the second thing is, like we said earlier, the power of questions.
yeah. I mean, the art of leading with questions is paramount, right? Just to create clarity, make sure we're both on the same page in terms of what we're understanding. I mean, one of the tricks I implemented long ago was wrapping up every meeting with just rehashing what the next steps are,
Mm-hmm.
and having people repeat back to me what I thought I communicated. And often it was, we were in alignment, and sometimes we said, "Well, that's not quite what I meant. Let's go a step further." But I think that back and forth, it's okay to sort of confirm next steps, confirm what was communicated, confirm the goal or the vision that we're going for achieving, right?
Yep.
Like it's I think one of the things we see with so much communication happening fast these days, whether it's text or it's a one sentence email or it's, there's this fine art between writing a page in an email and then writing a sentence, and it's got to be somewhere between. I often use bullet points just to say, here's the five next things that we agreed that we're going to take it, execute on.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, there's always room for it to be taken a little bit sideways. So I think it's an ongoing art of sort of
Yeah.
working with.
Yeah, it is. And if to go back to that kind of different modalities of communication, I mean, I've got three kids that are all young adults and they love texting. They were
Yeah.
texting with me all morning. My rule of thumb is if it's important, I'm picking up the phone, and even before then, I'm not going to try and arrange a cup of coffee. That would be my way. And I know it's old school, but there's so much room for misinterpretation in a text message. There's so much misinterpretation opportunity in an email. And in the absence of the nuance of facial expressions and body language and stuff like that, I really, particularly young aspiring leaders, I've got a client right now where they have a habit of having meetings and they're on a meetings platform, but nobody turns on their camera, and
Yeah.
I think you just lose so much opportunity. And I'm trying to get the culture back to the camera. And once you give people it's like remote work. Once you give people the opportunity to not turn their camera on, a lot of people aren't going to want to turn their camera on. And I think there's so much lost in
Yeah.
translation there. So I try and encourage as much as possible face to face like this over Zoom with the camera on. I don't know how you feel about that, Jeff.
No, I think 100%. I think, what you're reminding me of early in my career, I remember starting with this organization, and I mean, the CEO had just how he wanted the company to perform and sort of the rules and regulations of the company. And, they weren't extreme, but in there, he had a page that said how I like to communicate,
Mm-hmm.
that clearly articulated how he like, if you're going to bring a problem to the table, bring a solution with it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and he had a number of items like that. As we're talking, it's reminding me, we actually did exercises in a group of everybody sort of creating their bullet points of here's how I like to communicate. So, created some common understanding, and we developed that as a culture and as an organization. And um, and there were little things like in the meeting with a summary and everybody knowing what those next steps were in the meet. Somebody's responsible for sending out the follow-up email,
Mm-hmm.
summarizing the takeaways and what's next.
Yeah.
Again,
Yeah.
those were just little tips and tricks, but I thought it was very helpful for somebody to explain, here's how I like to communicate.
Yeah. I think the whole thing, as we wrap up, I think the whole thing's about not making assumptions, perhaps would be a way to
Right.
look at it. And I think when I coach people up in the career transition, professional development space, I make the mistake all the time. To this day, I think that what I know at the beginning of the conversation is so fundamental that they must already know it as well. And I always have to come back and say, no, you started that conversation at step 4. Now get back to step 1 and do it without being condescending, but don't presume that they know steps 1, 2, and 3. You're the guy with all the experience. And,
Yeah.
uh, and so, the best leaders that I've ever had were the quietest in meetings. They prompted things, they began the discussion, and then they encouraged people to go around the room and offer their opinions, and they just kept quiet. And then when they gathered all the information, then they had the context that was required to give a legitimate suggestion. And
Yeah.
I do this in interviews too. I tell people the extent to which you can go into an interview and get the other person to talk as much as possible before you open your mouth. Now your conversation is directed. You're not guessing and you're not making any assumption. And you can't always do that. But those are some of the techniques I think that I'd like people to take away from this little video.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, the art of leading with questions is paramount.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, you understand. The other thing I've noticed with great leaders, and we've talked about this before, is they'll just pause.
Mm-hmm.
So they're showing that they're listening, they're showing that they're learning, they're showing they're taking in the information. and giving critical thought before they speak.
Mhm.
I'm always kind of weary of the person who's got an immediate answer because it's almost like they're digging in with some sort of agenda. And I think the great leaders pause, take in all the information to then, really come up with a next step or a game plan that makes best sense.
Yeah, the pause is big time. I learned that from my dad when I was a kid. He used to say, Mark, what's the first, he was a fighter pilot, an airline pilot. What's the first thing you do when an engine catches on fire? I go, what? You go, nothing, you
Yeah.
know? And I think that's probably a good way to conclude. Oh, that was fun, Jeff. I love this. I love this topic. It's a great topic. We could do 10 videos on this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, in the earlier videos, we talked about, the importance of a vision. We talked about the importance of managing your personal fears. We talked the importance of sort of enrolling yourself or rolling others around you, kind of building your team.
Hmm.
I think a good exercise to take away in this particular episode, so to speak, is incorporating the pause, right? And then also thinking about going into meetings, going into communication with giving some pre-thought to the 2 or 3 questions that you can ask to sort of dig a level deeper and gain some clarity with whoever it is you're trying to lead or communicate with.
That's great advice, Jeff. I'll leave it at that. And I'm set the expectation as we've done in the last few episodes. We're going to keep doing these, trying to shoot for around 15 minutes, leadership being at the core, and then talking about sub segments of the leadership topic. So, and we're going to try and do this on a kind of a weekly cadence. You got anything else to add to that, Jeff?
No, I think it's great. Keep on communicating.
Yeah. Thanks, man. See you in the
Thank
next one.
you.